Keely Bunker was just 20 years old when she was raped and murdered by Wesley Street. Keely was out celebrating her birthday, and Street, a friend of hers, offered to walk her home. She trusted him, and he repaid her trust by raping and murdering her before dumping her body in a stream. Can you remember the news headlines? Can you remember how every single newspaper ran this as a front page story? Can you remember the protests, the vigils, and the celebrities lining up to pay tribute to Keely? Can you remember the politicians discussing Keely's death in Parliament? No, neither can I, because none of that happened. Keely Bunker's death flew mostly under the radar. I even remember tweeting about it at the time, and receiving the usual snarky responses from Twitter liberals questioning why I would even highlight such a case. After all, according to these liberals, it was just an unfortunate case where a young girl was murdered. But statistically, it was a rare occurrence, and anyone highlighting such a case was doing so for political reasons. But if you take the time to go through the articles about Keely's murder, you would quickly uncover the shocking truth about her killer, Wesley Street. When Street was convicted of Keely's murder, it emerged that he had previously raped and sexually assaulted a 16-year-old girl in 2015, that he had sexually assaulted a 15-year-old girl in 2017, and that in 2019 he had raped a 20-year-old woman who he had met on Snapchat. This is a case where a rapist and sex offender was allowed to operate freely on the streets of Britain, assaulting a number of girls over a prolonged period of time before eventually raping and murdering Keely Bunker. But there was no outrage. There were no national front page headlines calling for changes to the law, and there were no investigations into police failings. But why? Let's be totally honest. This horrific case was largely ignored by the national media and confined to local news reports because the victim was white and the murderer was black. Now let's compare the case of Keely Bunker with the case of Sarah Everard. Sarah Everard was 33 when she was kidnapped and murdered. Researching the case of Sarah Everard is much easier than researching the case of Keely Bunker, as unlike Keely, Sarah now has a Wikipedia page detailing everything about her tragic case. The suspect in the case of Sarah Everard is Wayne Couzens, a white police officer. Couzens appears to have a clean criminal record, although he has been previously accused of indecent exposure. Since the kidnap and murder of Sarah Everard, there has been unprecedented media coverage about the case. The story has dominated every single news feed for days. It has been on the front page of every national newspaper, and has been the main news headline on broadcast media for the best part of a week. There have been vigils, protests, and every single liberal who has a Twitter account has tweeted incessantly about the case. What's more, the case has been the subject of massive discussion in Parliament, with a member of the House of Lords going as far as to suggest a 6 p.m. curfew for all men, and the Conservative government have pledged new legislation to protect women, which includes a massive expansion of the surveillance state. Now let me make this entirely clear. The kidnap and murder of Sarah Everard was absolutely horrific, but at the same time, it is clear to see that it has been magnified to an incredible degree, and her murder is being weaponised to usher in new legislation that would increase government power and widen Britain's surveillance network. In other words, Sarah Everard's murder is being used as a justification to take away more of our rights and freedoms, and will likely be used to criminalise any speech or actions that could be deemed as misogynistic. Wolf whistles, flirtatious comments, jokes, and even staring at a woman could in future end up resulting in police action. But when comparing the cases of Sarah Everard and Keely Bunker, whilst both are horrific, the Keely Bunker case clearly highlights greater failings in the British criminal justice system. Keely Bunker's murderer had already committed a number of sex offences, including one against an underage girl. Yet he was free to walk the street, raping and sexually assaulting a number of girls before eventually murdering Keely Bunker. Yet despite this, the case didn't receive anywhere near as much media attention. And the failure of the police to prevent Keely's murder was never discussed in Parliament. And there seems to be a clear reason as to why one of these cases made national headlines and why the other didn't. It's quite simple. The suspect in the Sarah Everard case is white, whilst Keely Bunker's killer is black. The British establishment has a long history of covering up crimes against the indigenous people when said crimes are perpetrated by those of immigrant descent. Whether it is the police and the government covering up the grooming of hundreds of thousands of white girls by Muslim men, or whether it is the press and the media burying reports of rape, assault and murder when the victim is white and the perpetrator is an immigrant or a person of colour, the pattern is clear. White people are already second-class citizens, and things will only get worse, much worse. And this is highlighted by the fact that the murder of a white girl is only truly newsworthy if her killer is a white man, and her death can be used to further demonise white men and help pass legislation that expands government power. But if a white girl is raped or murdered and the rapist or killer is not white, then the story goes down the memory hole, and the victim is essentially just another silent sacrifice upon the altar of multiculturalism. An altar that sits atop an ever-growing pile of bodies, of nameless and forgotten victims.